Why is it that in the age of unlimited information, people seem dumber, more divided, and less capable of critical thinking than ever before? Let that question sink in. We live in a time when every fact, every theory, every piece of history is supposedly just a click away. You can sit in a coffee shop in Texas, type a question into your phone, and instantly receive more information than an entire library could hold 20 years ago. By all logic, this should be humanity's golden age of wisdom. But instead, it feels like we are regressing, arguing more, thinking less, and confusing noise with knowledge. Just scroll through your feed and you'll see it. During election season, fake news floods Facebook and X, spreading faster than any fact checker could ever keep up with. On TikTok, meaningless trends dominate millions of screens while serious issues go ignored. Political conversations, even among friends or family, rarely sound like dialogue anymore. They sound like battle shouting, finger pointing, and endless attempts to own the other side. This isn't the mark of a society thinking critically. It's the mark of a society addicted to outrage. The numbers back up what you've already felt in your gut. According to the National Assessment of Adult Literacy, only 36% of American adults can pass a basic test of critical thinking and reasoning. That was 2 decades ago, in 2003, and updates since then reveal little progress. In other words, the majority of American adults struggle with the very skills needed to filter truth from lies in today's chaotic information landscape. And it's not just academics raising the alarm. Pew Research reported in 2023 that 64% of Americans believe misinformation spreading online poses a major threat to society. Not a minor inconvenience, an existential risk to how we live, vote, and make decisions. Yet despite this awareness, we still fall into the same trap, scrolling, sharing, reacting without slowing down to ask 3 simple questions. Is this true? Where is the evidence? Who gains if I believe this? So here we stand, in an era of infinite content, armed with limitless tools for knowledge, and yet, we are watching critical thinking quietly die before our eyes. Before we dive deeper into the heart of this topic, let me ask you for a quick favor. If you find value in questioning the world around you, if you believe that real growth begins with honest reflection, then make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll be the first to know when I release the next video content designed not just to entertain, but to challenge, provoke, and awaken. Every day, I share insights that help you see beyond the noise, cut through the illusion, and reconnect with your own power to think freely. Don't let the algorithms decide what you see. Take control so you won't miss what could be the idea that changes everything for you. Critical thinking has often been called the art of questioning, according to the Foundation for Critical Thinking, 2020. It can be defined as the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, or communication as a guide to belief and action. In other words, it is the ability to step back from what you are told, examine it from multiple angles, and determine whether it is credible, logical, and useful. For centuries, this skill was not just an intellectual luxury, it was considered the foundation of education itself. In the American tradition, critical thinking was once the beating heart of liberal arts education. Universities proudly advertised their capacity to teach students how to argue, debate, and interrogate the world around them. Debate clubs thrived in high schools, where students were encouraged to defend positions they might not personally agree with, forcing them to wrestle with evidence, rhetoric, and counterarguments. The essence of being educated was not simply to memorize facts or perform well on exams, but to emerge as an independent thinker, capable of discerning truth from manipulation and navigating a democratic society that depends on informed citizens. But that ideal has eroded. Slowly, almost invisibly, American education has shifted from cultivating minds to conditioning behaviors. Instead of teaching students how to think, schools are now largely focused on what to remember. The rise of standardized testing, SAT assessments, has redefined the measure of intelligence. In practice, students are rewarded not for asking hard questions, but for reproducing predetermined answers. As long as they can circle the correct bubble or recall a formula, they are considered prepared. This shift reflects a deeper cultural change. Once, the image of a good student was someone who could debate vigorously, challenge authority, and synthesize complex ideas. Today, a good student is often described as compliant, efficient, and able to quickly absorb material that may never be questioned. And while this might produce impressive report cards, it leaves students unprepared for a world saturated with misinformation, ideological manipulation, and rapidly evolving technology. Take, for example, a common scene in American high school classroom preparing for the SAT. The teacher is drilling students on vocabulary lists, geometry formulas, and grammar rules. The students are told that success lies in mastering these facts, because the test will not reward them for asking, whose knowledge is being tested here? Why does this particular set of facts matter? How do we know this is the best way to measure intelligence? The very questions that form the core of critical thinking are not just absent, they are actively discouraged, since they waste time and may distract from the exam objective. Even when students consume information outside the classroom, the same pattern persists. Instead of learning how to analyze sources, they are trained to search quickly, skim headlines, and trust algorithms to curate what they need. News comes filtered through social media feeds, where the metric is not truth but engagement. The skill of weighing evidence, detecting bias, and questioning the credibility of an argument is quietly replaced by the passive habit of scrolling and liking. The irony is striking. We live in an era where critical thinking is more necessary than ever. Every day, we are bombarded with claims about politics, health, science, and culture. Artificial intelligence generates convincing but often misleading text and images. Conspiracy theories thrive because they offer simple narratives in a complex world. Without critical thinking, individuals are defenseless, vulnerable to manipulation by corporations, governments, and influencers who understand the psychology of persuasion better than the average citizen understands logic. And yet, our education system continues to prepare students for a world that no longer exists, one where knowledge was scarce, facts were stable, and authority could be trusted. In reality, we now inhabit a landscape where knowledge is abundant, facts are contested, and authority is fragmented. The old tools of rote memorization and passive learning are not just outdated, they are dangerous. They leave students unable to protect themselves intellectually. The disappearance of critical thinking is not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual erosion. Each year, debate clubs shrink, philosophy courses are cut, and curricula become more test-driven. Each time students are told, just memorize this for the exam, instead of, let's analyze why this matters, another thread of critical capacity unravels. If left unchecked, the result is a generation of young people who can code, calculate, and recite, but who cannot question. They may be technologically fluent, but philosophically illiterate. They may ace their exams, but fail to recognize propaganda. They may succeed in careers, but struggle in citizenship. Critical thinking was once America's great educational promise. Today, it is becoming its most urgent educational loss. The disappearance of critical thinking is not an accident. It is the product of deep structural forces that shape how we consume information, how our attention is captured, and how we are educated. 4 major drivers stand out: information overload and the attention economy, the manipulative power of social media algorithms, an outdated education system, and the stubborn influence of cognitive biases. The information overload and the attention economy. In 2023, researchers at the University of California San Diego estimated that the average American is exposed to 34 gigabytes of information every single day. That number is almost impossible to imagine. Thousands of notifications, endless feeds, streaming content, podcasts, ads, emails, and breaking news alerts. Our brains, however, are not built for this flood. Human cognition evolved in an environment where information was scarce and survival depended on remembering only what was essential. When faced with more data than we can reasonably process, the mind looks for shortcuts. Instead of carefully analyzing every piece of information, we rely on heuristics, mental rules of thumb, emotional cues, and gut reactions. This makes us vulnerable to manipulation. A headline that provokes fear or anger is far more likely to stick than a nuanced essay that requires concentration. In the attention economy, where companies profit from every second of our focus, emotional triggers consistently outcompete rational analysis. As a result, critical thinking is not just neglected, it is actively penalized. Slowing down to evaluate evidence feels costly in a world designed to reward instant reactions. B. Social media algorithms. The structure of the digital world magnifies these vulnerabilities. A landmark study from MIT, Vasugi, Roy, and Arl, Science, 2018, showed that false information spreads 6 times faster on Twitter than the truth. Why? Because lies are often packaged in ways that are more novel, more emotionally shocking, and more shareable. Algorithms that govern platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok are not neutral. They are optimized to maximize engagement. A leaked internal report from Meta, published by the Wall Street Journal in 2021, confirmed what many had long suspected. Posts that provoke anger and outrage receive the highest engagement. In other words, the platforms that dominate public discourse are engineered to amplify the very content least conducive to critical thought. Subtle arguments, balanced perspectives, and careful analysis do not go viral. Instead, what thrives are simplistic slogans, conspiracy theories, and emotionally charged half-truths. The social reward structure has flipped upside down. We now reward stupidity and punish nuance. In such an environment, those who try to apply critical thinking asking for context, questioning evidence, or pointing out complexities often find themselves drowned out by louder, angrier voices. The marketplace of ideas has become less about truth and more about spectacle. C. An outdated education system. If social media rewards emotional shortcuts, schools are supposed to provide the antidote. Yet the American education system has increasingly failed to do so. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 2022, only 37% of U.S. 12th graders are proficient in reading and analytical skills. This is not simply about literacy. It reflects a deeper inability to evaluate, interpret, and reason through complex texts. One reason is policy. For decades, education has been shaped by the obsession with standardized testing. High-stakes exams determine school funding, teacher evaluations, and student futures. As a result, classrooms prioritize compliance and memorization over curiosity and inquiry. Students are drilled on how to extract the right answer from a multiple-choice question, rather than how to construct their own argument. This approach may produce short-term gains in test scores, but it undermines the very skill set students need to navigate adulthood. When young people graduate, they may know how to follow instructions, but they struggle to discern reliable sources from propaganda or to defend their beliefs with evidence. An education system designed to produce test takers is inevitably ill-equipped to produce thinkers. D. Cognitive biases. Even if schools and platforms were perfect, the human mind itself presents challenges. Cognitive psychology has shown that we are not natural critical thinkers. In fact, our brains are riddled with biases. Among the most notorious is the Dunning-Kruger effect, Kruger and Dunning, 1999, which reveals that people with the least knowledge in a domain are often the most confident in their judgments. This creates a paradox. The very individuals least qualified to assess evidence may be the loudest voices in the room. Combine this with confirmation bias, the tendency to seek information that supports what we already believe, and the problem deepens. Social media echo chambers reinforce these biases, surrounding us with voices that mirror our own assumptions and shielding us from dissent. Over time, this creates a dangerous feedback loop. The less we know, the more certain we feel. The more certain we feel, the less open we are to learning. Critical thinking requires humility, self-awareness, and a willingness to be wrong. But the architecture of human psychology, amplified by modern technology, often pushes us in the opposite direction toward overconfidence, tribalism, and rigidity. The decline of critical thinking is not the fault of any single institution or generation. It is the combined result of information overload, profit-driven algorithms, outdated education, and human biases that have always existed but are now supercharged by technology. Together, these forces form a perfect storm. A society that consumes more information than ever before, yet questions less. A culture that celebrates certainty while punishing doubt. And a generation trained to memorize facts but not to challenge them. If we wish to revive critical thinking, we must first understand how it is being systematically undermined. Only then can we begin to rebuild the habits of mind that democracy, truth, and freedom depend on. To understand how the erosion of critical thinking plays out in real life, we don't need abstract theories. We need only to look at recent American history. Two moments stand out as stark reminders: the COVID-19 pandemic and the 2020 presidential election. Both crises reveal how easily misinformation can spread, how deeply it can shape behavior, and how vulnerable societies become when critical thinking collapses. Case Study 1. COVID-19 misinformation. When the coronavirus spread across the globe in 2020, science moved at lightning speed. Vaccines were developed in record time, researchers openly shared data, and public health agencies issued constant guidance. Yet, alongside this progress came an avalanche of conspiracy theories. According to a 2021 Kaiser Family Foundation health tracking poll, 78% of Americans reported believing at least one false claim about COVID-19 or the vaccines. These ranged from the idea that the virus was engineered as a weapon, to myths about microchips hidden in vaccines, to outright denial of the virus's existence. This was not just a matter of idle speculation. Believing misinformation had deadly consequences, vaccine hesitancy prolonged the pandemic. Misinformation about masks influenced public policy, and thousands of preventable deaths followed. The tragedy was not that information was unavailable, but that it was drowned in a sea of noise where emotional narratives outshouted scientific reasoning. In this chaos, critical thinking, evaluating sources, distinguishing fact from fiction, became a survival skill many did not possess. Case Study 2. The 2020 Election. A similar pattern unfolded after the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Despite an absence of credible evidence, and despite courts rejecting more than 60 lawsuits challenging the results, millions of Americans came to believe the election was rigged. Social media platforms amplified rumors. Fringe commentators gained massive audiences, and what began as suspicion hardened into conviction for a large segment of the population. The consequences were historic. On January 6, 2021, misinformation fueled one of the most dramatic attacks on democratic institutions in American history, the storming of the U.S. Capitol. Again, the failure was not a lack of evidence. The evidence was clear, but a failure of collective reasoning. When emotion, identity, and group loyalty outweighed rational evaluation, falsehoods became more persuasive than truth. Philosophical reflection. These stories confirm something thinkers have warned about for centuries. Friedrich Nietzsche once observed, "Madness is the exception in individuals, but the rule in groups." When critical thinking erodes, Collective behavior often sinks into irrationality. What seems unthinkable for an individual alone can become normalized when shared by a crowd. Carl Jung went further, warning that the collective unconscious, if left unexamined, could mutate into a collective delusion. Every society has a shadow fears, resentments, and unacknowledged desires. When those shadows remain hidden, they erupt in distorted forms: conspiracy theories, scapegoating, and mass hysteria. In the pandemic and in politics alike, America confronted its own shadow. The failure to recognize it allowed misinformation to fill the void. Both case studies reveal the same truth. Without critical thinking, societies cannot defend themselves against deception. The danger is not only in the falsehoods themselves, but in the collective readiness to embrace them. When a nation loses the ability to question, verify, and reflect, it becomes vulnerable to its own darkest impulses. The disappearance of critical thinking is not a harmless cultural shift. It carries profound consequences that are reshaping the very fabric of American society. When a population loses its ability to question, analyze, and discern, the result is not neutrality, it is vulnerability. This vulnerability expresses itself in three particularly alarming ways: political extremism, collapsing trust in institutions, and a generation losing the ability to focus deeply. Political extremism and polarization. The most visible outcome of collective stupidity is the intensification of political polarization. In a nation already divided by ideology, the inability to engage in critical dialogue only deepens the chasm. Nuance the recognition that issues are complex, that compromise is necessary, that opponents may sometimes have valid points has become nearly impossible. Instead, debates quickly devolve into tribal shouting matches. Social media platforms amplify this extremism by rewarding the loudest, most sensational voices. Politicians and commentators who appeal to fear and outrage rise in visibility, while those who offer balanced analysis are ignored. The result is an environment where extremism is not the fringe, it is the center of attention. And when the collective mind of society tilts towards simplistic slogans rather than careful reasoning, democracy itself weakens. Collapse of public trust in media, hand in hand with polarization, is a collapse in public trust. According to a 2022 Gallup poll, only 34% of Americans say they trust the mass media to report the news fully, accurately, and fairly. This is near a historic low. Such distrust has cascading effects. If citizens do not believe journalists, they are more likely to turn to partisan outlets, influencers, or unverified online sources that confirm their biases. The danger is not simply that people distrust the media. The deeper problem is that in rejecting traditional sources, many individuals also lose any shared basis of truth. Society fractures into multiple realities, each with its own facts, its own narratives, its own enemies. Without trust in a common information base, collective decision-making, whether in politics, public health, or economics, becomes almost impossible. The decline of deep reading and long-term focus. Another consequence, less dramatic but equally destructive, is the decline of sustained attention. Today's younger generations are growing up in an environment saturated by short-form content, TikTok clips, Instagram reels, endless scrolling feeds. While such content can be entertaining, it also trains the brain to expect constant stimulation. Studies suggest that the more time people spend on rapid, fragmented information, the harder it becomes to engage in deep reading or long-term focus. Books, essays, and in-depth analysis begin to feel too slow. This erosion of attention is devastating for critical thinking, because analysis requires patience. To weigh evidence, compare perspectives, and follow complex arguments takes more than a 30-second attention span. A society that loses the ability to focus loses the capacity to think. The spread of collective stupidity does not simply make individuals less informed. It destabilizes the entire culture. It breeds political extremism that tears communities apart. destroys trust in the very institutions that hold democracy together, and erodes the mental stamina required for careful reasoning. These consequences feed one another in a dangerous loop. Polarization fuels distrust, distrust fuels disengagement, and disengagement fuels further ignorance. Critical thinking, once the foundation of American education and civic life, has become a rare skill. And without it, the consequences will only grow more severe. The decline of critical thinking is not inevitable. While the forces driving collective stupidity are powerful, they are not unstoppable. The antidote begins with deliberate choices, choices made by individuals, communities, educators, and even technology companies. Reviving critical thought will not happen overnight, but it can happen if we commit to rebuilding the habits of questioning, reflection, and open dialogue. Individual solutions. The most immediate step begins at the personal level. Every time we encounter information, whether it's a news headline, a viral post, or a conversation, we have the choice to pause and question. A practical tool for this is the 3 critical questions test. Who is saying this? What is the evidence? Who benefits if I believe it? These 3 questions are deceptively simple, yet they force us to slow down and consider the motives, credibility, and implications of the messages we receive. Applying this framework regularly builds mental discipline and helps us resist manipulation. Another powerful experiment is a 7-day newsfeed detox. Instead of scrolling endlessly through algorithm-driven platforms, commit to 1 week of consuming only long-form journalism, essays, or books. This shift trains the brain to re-engage with depth rather than distraction. For many, such an exercise reveals just how addicted we've become to bite-sized content, and how liberating it feels to return to focused, thoughtful reading. Community and educational solutions. While personal discipline matters, critical thinking must also be nurtured within communities and institutions. Schools, in particular, play a central role. For generations, American education emphasized the value of debate clubs, liberal arts curricula, and the Socratic method practices that encourage students to question assumptions, argue from evidence, and listen to opposing views. Today, these traditions have been sidelined by the dominance of standardized testing, which rewards memorization over reasoning. Reversing this trend means redesigning classrooms to prioritize inquiry over compliance. Students should be challenged not only to find the right answers, but to ask better questions. Encouraging debate, teaching media literacy, and incorporating philosophy and rhetoric into curricula can cultivate the intellectual resilience that standardized tests cannot measure. Communities outside schools can also contribute. Book clubs, discussion groups, and even family dinner conversations can become training grounds for critical thinking when participants practice respectful disagreement. The goal is not to create uniformity of thought, but to normalize the act of questioning together. Technological solutions. Technology companies also bear responsibility. The algorithms that shape online discourse are not neutral. They are designed to maximize engagement, often at the expense of truth and reason. Demanding algorithmic transparency is essential. Users deserve to know why certain posts appear in their feeds and what values are being prioritized. Without transparency, manipulation thrives unchecked. In addition, platforms must invest in robust fact-checking and elevate content that demonstrates credibility and nuance, rather than rewarding outrage. While no system will be perfect, even incremental shifts in platform incentives can make a massive difference in how information circulates. Imagine an online ecosystem where accuracy and context were rewarded as strongly as virality. The public square would begin to look far less chaotic and far more conducive to meaningful dialogue. A cultural mindset shift. Ultimately, the revival of critical thinking is not just about individual tools, school reforms, or tech regulations. It is about shifting cultural values. We must learn once again to admire curiosity more than certainty, patience more than speed, and nuance more than simplicity. This requires celebrating those who ask difficult questions, rather than mocking them for being too serious. It requires teaching young people that skepticism is not cynicism, but a form of respect for truth. Critical thinking is not the rejection of belief. It is the commitment to ensuring that belief rests on solid ground. In a culture that rewards instant reactions, reviving this commitment will feel countercultural. But it is precisely this countercultural stance that can save us from the spiral of collective stupidity. Reviving critical thinking is both an individual practice and a collective responsibility. By asking sharper questions, detoxing from shallow content, redesigning education to value debate, and demanding more from technology platforms, we can begin to restore the intellectual backbone of society. The challenge is daunting, but the alternative, a future where truth is drowned out by noise and reason by emotion, is far worse. The choice is ours: to remain passive consumers of information, or to become active thinkers once again. Critical thinking is not vanishing because it has suddenly become impossible. It is vanishing because we, as individuals and as a culture, have stopped practicing it. Like a muscle that atrophies when neglected, our ability to question, analyze, and reflect weakens when we trade discipline for convenience and depth for distraction. The tragedy is not that the skill is unattainable, it is that we have surrendered it. The good news is that what has been surrendered can also be reclaimed. The first step is to recognize that critical thinking does not flourish in theory, it flourishes in practice. Every day presents us with opportunities to sharpen this capacity, but only if we take them seriously. To begin, I challenge you to commit to a 7-day media detox. For 1 week, step away from algorithm-driven feeds that bombard you with outrage, sensationalism, and trivial distractions. Instead, consume only primary sources and long-form content. Read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Dive into academic journals, or pick up a well-researched book. At first, the slower pace may feel uncomfortable, but soon you will rediscover the difference between passive scrolling and active reading. You will notice how clarity emerges when noise is stripped away. Alongside this detox, adopt a daily practice I call the counter-argument journal. Each day, set aside 15 minutes to write down one belief you hold strongly about politics, culture, personal values, or even your daily life, and then argue against yourself. Ask, what if I am wrong? What evidence might I be ignoring? How would someone on the other side see this issue? This exercise may not change your mind immediately, but it will strengthen your intellectual humility. More importantly, it will train you to see that truth often has more than one angle. To sustain this journey, nourish your mind with books that challenge your assumptions and expand your understanding. Start with Daniel Kahneman's Thinking, Fast and Slow, which exposes the hidden biases in our reasoning, showing how often we mistake intuition for truth. Then read Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, a prophetic warning about the dangers of entertainment-driven culture that feels even more urgent in the age of TikTok and endless scrolling. These works are not just books. They are antidotes to a society drowning in distraction. But beyond practices and reading lists, what matters most is a shift in attitude. Critical thinking is not an act of cynicism. It is not about tearing everything down or refusing to believe in anything. It is an act of courage, the courage to admit that we do not have all the answers, and the humility to keep searching. It requires patience in a culture obsessed with speed, and honesty in a culture addicted to self-deception. It means asking questions even when the answers are uncomfortable, and resisting the seductive pull of easy narratives. Make no mistake, the stakes are high. As long as we allow our attention to be hijacked by algorithms and our minds dulled by endless streams of noise, the war for our freedom will not be fought with weapons, it will be fought with distractions. And the truth is, many of us are already losing. We are surrendering our ability to think, one click, one scroll, one unexamined belief at a time. But you do not have to lose. You can reclaim your mind. You can cultivate the discipline to pause before reacting, to question before believing, to reflect before judging. This is not just a personal choice, it is a civic duty. Democracies depend on citizens capable of reasoning. Communities thrive when people can disagree without dehumanizing each other. And individuals grow when they dare to look beyond the comforting illusion of certainty. So here is the invitation. For the next 7 days, live as if your mind truly matters, because it does. Step away from the noise. Read deeply. Write your counter-arguments. Challenge yourself. And when you do, you will discover that critical thinking is not dead. It has simply been waiting for you to bring it back to life. The war for your mind is already underway. It is not fought with guns or armies. It is fought with distractions, with half-truths, with the seduction of the easy answer. You can only win if you reclaim your ability to think. The choice, as always, is yours. If this video sparked something in you, if it reminded you that your mind is worth protecting, then don't let the journey stop here. Hit the like button so this message reaches more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next videos will take you even deeper into the tools and ideas that can awaken your critical mind and free your inner self. And I'd love to hear from you. What was the most powerful lesson for you today? Was it the story, the statistics, or the insight from Nietzsche and Jung? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the spark that wakes someone else up.